Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this training session brought to you by the Society of American Archivists, Archivists of Religious Collections section. My name is Vinny Barraza, and we acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. We know that Indigenous peoples have suffered from historical and ongoing injustices and understand as an archival organization that we must work towards sharing historical truths and renew respectful relationships with Indigenous communities. We respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land as the original caretakers. We are grateful for their stewardship and protection of the water and earth. We pay our respects to elders past and present. Today's topic is NDSA Levels of Preservation. Before I introduce our presenters, let's review the disclaimer. The content in these presentations is for information only and is not legal advice. Our views do not represent the organizations where we work. We do not make any endorsements or guarantees. We are not liable for any loss or damage caused by your use of the content we provide, and it is your responsibility to critically evaluate the content provided in the presentation or any accompanying materials. Also, please remember the points shown on this slide. You will not be able to use your microphone or video during this session. You can click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen, and under live transcript, click Enable Auto Transcription to get closed captioning. There will be a question period after the presentation concludes. You should use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. We will not answer questions in the chat or unmute attendees due to time constraints. Please be respectful in your interactions, and we expect everyone to follow the SAA Code of Conduct. This session will be recorded. Please fill out the short survey after the session ends. We encourage you to join the Society of American Archivists if you're not a member. We thank the Congregation of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Canada for hosting this webinar. And I would like to introduce our presenters. First, Jenny Mitchum is Head of Good Practice and Standards at the Digital Preservation Coalition. She works closely with the members of the coalition on their digital preservation challenges, as well as organizing events and producing publications and resources to help move the community forward with digital preservation. She is currently serving on the NDSA leadership team and is one of the co-chairs of the NDSA Levels of Digital Preservation. She specializes in certification and maturity modeling and has an interest in finding ways of lowering the barriers to digital preservation for those who are just getting started in this field. As well, Nathan Tallman will be joining us. As Digital Preservation Librarian at Penn State University, Nathan coordinates policies, workflows, and practices to ensure the long-term preservation and accessibility of the library's born digital and digitized collections. He advises on equipment, infrastructure, and vendors for Penn State digital content. Nathan is also product owner for digital preservation and helps to coordinate community practices and support for digital collection infrastructure. Nathan is a past chair of the NDSA Coordinating Committee and has served on the NDSA Levels Steering Group since 2020. Prior to Penn State, Nathan was the digital content strategist at the University of Cincinnati and associate archivist at the American Jewish Archives. He earned his MLS and BS in Business Administration from the State University of New York at Buffalo. So, go ahead.
Great, thanks for that introduction, Vincent, and thanks for inviting us here today. So if you move to the next slide, Nathan, thank you. So we're going to start off with an introduction to the NDSA levels, and then we're going to try a little bit of a workshop section in the middle where you get to have a go at using it, and we'll see how that goes. Fingers crossed it works. But before we go into the NDSA levels themselves, I just wanted to set that in the context of digital preservation certification and maturity modeling. So next slide, please. As I'm sure you're all aware, digital preservation can be quite hard. That's indeed one of the reasons why organisations such as the NDSA and indeed the DPC exist, to bring together communities and facilitate sharing of knowledge. If it wasn't hard, we could probably all just quietly get on with it by ourselves. So in order to make progress with digital preservation, we might want to get answers to the following questions. So firstly, what does digital preservation good practice actually look like? That's a big one. Secondly, how are you doing at the moment? And then where do you think you should be? So perhaps you think your organisation should be further advanced in digital preservation than it actually is. And then I guess the logical next question would be around what you need to do in order to get to where you think you should be. So assuming there's a gap that needs to be bridged there, what steps do you need to take to actually move forward? And I've also added another question in there at the bottom. And that's because increasingly we may also be interested in how everyone else is doing. So it's often helpful for us to understand where we are as compared to our peers and have a shared framework within which we can discuss and compare our progress as well. So that process of benchmarking and comparison can be really beneficial in terms of just prompting conversations and prompting collaboration. So that's actually one of the things we're going to try and do within the workshop section today. So next slide, please. So perhaps it might be logical to think that the Open Archival Information System has all the answers. So hopefully most of you might have come across OAIS in some form or another, but if you haven't, it looks a bit like this diagram on the right here. And it's certainly a helpful way of understanding just the sorts of activities that should go on within a digital archive. But what it doesn't really do is provide much information on what steps we need to take to get started, and then how we can continue to logically progress from there. So there are certification standards based on OAIS, so there's TRAC and ISO 16363, but these are definitely not at beginner level, and they're not typically a route that I recommend to people either. So next slide, please, Nathan. So how do we actually measure good practice in digital preservation? So this slide shows a really oversimplified view of the self-assessment and certification landscape, as there are actually far more options than this. So this is just showing four particular standards here. But hopefully this just gives the idea that there are a number of ways that you can assess yourself, and also that some ways are more complicated than others. So if we start at the right, I just mentioned ISO 16363, and this is certainly the most complex of the digital preservation certification standards. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend you kind of dive into that or put that in your sites. It's really complicated. But I guess a more entry-level certification standard is the Core Trust Seal. So this is far more achievable, and many within the community have been awarded this. However, it does still require a substantial amount of work to achieve, and the effort involved shouldn't be underestimated. And then moving from formal certification standards to maturity models, DPC-RAM is the Digital Preservation Coalition's maturity model, and one that's fairly quick and simple to use. And I will say a little bit more about that later on. But by far the simplest maturity model for digital preservation is the very colourful NDSA Levels, which is on the left here. NDSA Levels of Digital Preservation, to give it its full name. And Nathan's going to now tell you a little bit more about that.
So before we get into some of the details of the levels, a little bit about what they're here for, why they're created, who can use them. So they're here for anyone who's working at a memory organization or any organization that needs to retain information for some purpose. They are meant to be sort of a technical distillation of how to do or some strategies for digital preservation. It's not everything. There are things outside of technology around digital preservation. So certainly do need attention to be taken care of. But the levels are really here to provide a place for that sort of brass tacks technical strategies. How do we do this? You don't have to be an expert. They're really designed for anyone to come in and use, including non-experts or people who maybe have not worked in digital preservation before at that organization, but suddenly find themselves in a situation where they're tasked with doing something on these regards. There's also a really great set of working definitions that are in the sort of Levels 2019 reboot. There's actually more supplementary materials that we'll get to later on in the presentation, but those working definitions, especially for folks who are are new to digital preservation can be really helpful because there's a lot of jargon. It is technical. There are vocabularies that we use that might be unfamiliar. So the working definitions can be a really helpful place to look for those. But let's talk a little bit about the levels themselves. So this is the matrix of the levels, the most recent version from 2019. And typically when someone says the levels, this is kind of what they're referring to, this chart here. The levels, as you see, he starts off at level 1 and builds up to level 4. So they are successive and cumulative. If you are at level 3, you are also at level 1 and 2. But, and it's really important to note that this is not meant to be a leaderboard. It's not meant to drive everything towards level 4 digital preservation, because that's going to be a really important strategy for you in terms of sustainability and appraisal and selection is to what is the right preservation strategy for the content you're working on. And you might apply different strategies for different parts of your content. So maybe some of your collection or particular collection should be level 4, but perhaps other things could be a level 2. It's really something that you'll decide for yourself. And one thing to remember, any preservation is always better than no preservation. So the level 1s are really designed to be easy to start with, and that does get you further along than you were before and is starting to work towards preservation of that material. If you look along the left in that purple all the way over, these are the functional areas as we call them. You could think about these as categories. So if digital preservation is a set of managed activities that we do in order to preserve and make sure that information is accessible in the future, these categories are groups of those managed activities that take place over time. And as you look across at each level, you'll see an increasing amount of goals or objectives that could be achieved to obtain that level of preservation for your content. One thing to mention, I talked about selection and appraisal and trying to identify what is the right strategy for the particular content you're looking at. We're not meant to be focusing too much on selection and appraisal here, but I do want to mention the environmental impact of digital preservation. Digital preservation uses a lot of data, information and communication technology, a lot of data storage. And if we have everything at level 4 and we've got 4 or 5 copies and they're constantly checking in with each other to make sure everyone's complete and that the files haven't lost anything, there is a significant environmental impact. Data centers are surpassing the airline industry as one of the top global polluters. So that is something to encourage you to take into consideration. And if we can share the slides after, there's some resources we can point you to. But let's just take a look at this storage functional area and look at this across these levels. And I apologize, I'm going to be looking at a different screen so I actually can read the text. So I'm not going to be looking at you. I apologize for that. But on storage under Know Your Content level 1, so we have 2 copies in separate locations. Now, separate locations becomes more qualified and distinctive as you move through up to level 4, but this could just mean you have a copy on a hard drive on one building, and maybe you have another building and there's a copy over there. Or maybe you send a copy home on a hard drive with one of your employees. So it's in a different part of town maybe, but you have 2 copies of your digital content and you document where all those are located. So there's one on this shelf in this room and Mary has a copy over there. And you really do want to be using stable storage. So you want to avoid things like flash drives, or other, which could be easily lost or potentially damaged. You probably don't want to be using legacy storage formats. You want something that's going to be modern and you can use easily. Level 2, protect your content. Now we're starting to have 3 copies and one of them in a different geographic location. So maybe this one, you have a partner organization in your region or state or territory, and you send each other copies. So you each have a copy of that material, and it's in a different zone. It's in a different part of the continent, which has sort of different risks and inherently to it. And you'll start to do more documentation around that storage media. If you're using anything that might be a little less than typical, you might need to have some documentation around how you use that. Maybe you have some old magneto-optical disks kicking around that you haven't been able to transfer yet. And that's a type of a data format that you're not going to be able to use on modern equipment. So you might need to document it if you're going to need that. Level 3, all right, where now we have copies, we have a different geographic location and a different disaster threat. So it's important to think about what risk occurs to those copies where they live. And sometimes if you're using cloud copies, you have to think about where actually the data center is for that cloud storage. But let's just say a copy in California and a copy in Florida, right? We have different geographic threats. In California, we've got wildfires. There is some sea level rise and things happening in Florida. Well, there's some sea level rise, but hurricanes are kind of the major threat. So it's a different type of disaster that you're mitigating against. You'll also start to use multiple storage media. So maybe instead of just spinning disk hard drives, you'll have solid state hard drives, or maybe you might even use LTO tape. You'll also begin to track the obsolescence of that storage and media. So hard drives and tapes can last a while on a shelf, but they don't last forever. And so one of the things we have to do is to document how old is that? When is the last time we refreshed that media? When's the last time we actually plugged it in and made sure that we could still access the content on that disk? And at the highest, level 4, we have 3 copies in different geographic locations with disaster threat, at least 3 copies. So you might have 4 or 5. We're going to maximize that storage diversification. So you're not only using different maybe disks, but you're using different manufacturer batches of those disks. And you really have a plan. So we talked about tracking the obsolescence of the storage. How old is this drive? When was this come into place? When's the last time this was accessed? And then so you're building on from there. What is your plan to ensure that that hard drive will remain operational over time while you're responsible for using that content? Doesn't look like we have it on this slide, but I'm going to read you a URL that hopefully you can open up in a new tab on your computer to have this matrix available to you for some of the exercises that Jen's going to lead us in a second here. So https://osf.io/2 and then these lowercase letters, MKWX. So that's osf.io/2 MKWX in lowercase. And I do think that that will be on a future slide, but if you could pull that up, I think you'll be a step ahead. And I'm going to turn it over to Jen.
Great, thanks, Nathan. And I think that link has appeared in the chat. So click on that link, get a copy of the levels up, that'd be great. So we're going to go have a go at using the levels now after that brief introduction. We feel like you're ready. You're ready to dive in. Fingers crossed. So next slide, please, Nathan. So this is what we're going to do next. As discussed, we'd like you to get a copy of the levels to work with during this session and have that open on a tab. As Nathan said, you can get that from the OSF site. The link's in the chat there for you. And once you've got a copy of the levels, I'd also like you to go to menti.com. I think there's a link about to appear in the chat for menti.com. Because we're going to do some anonymous benchmarking using Mentimeter as well. There you go. Thank you very much. So all we're going to do once we get going is take each row of the levels in turn. And I'd like you all to simply try and work out what level you're at. And once you've taken some time to think about that, we'll be using Mentimeter to collect your responses and just have a little look at the lie of the land, if that's okay. So hopefully everyone's got a copy of the levels downloaded into hand, and I can see that the Mentimeter is working because people are already answering the first question, which is fantastic. So I'll just wait for a few more people to come into that.
Jen, should I stop sharing?
Yeah, please stop sharing, and I will share the Mentimeter. Thanks, Nathan. Hold on a moment. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So the first question on the poll is, describe your previous experience with the NDSA levels. So we're really just interested to know if you're coming to this new today or if you've used them before. It's also just a useful way of testing if the Mentimeter is working, with an easy question before we actually get you working hard, looking at the levels and thinking about where you are. It looks like it's working. It looks like we've got 106 responses, and you can see the answers starting to take shape there. So yeah, it looks like people are still answering. Do dive in and answer if you can. I understand you're probably also eating your lunch at the same time, so this might be a little bit of a juggling act for you. So apologies if you weren't expecting this. So that's interesting to see. So we've got the majority of people perhaps who've heard of the levels but haven't used it. So that's great. It's a great sort of opportunity for you to have a go at it today. Got a few people who've never heard of it before, a few who've tried to use it but need help. And if you need help from us, like, we're here to help you today. So do pop questions in the chat. I know that we won't be able to address those questions till the end, but if you have questions for us specifically, we can try and help you with those. Perhaps also they're questions for other people within your organisation, so you need to go away and ask others. Oh, that's fine too, just make a note of them. We've got a few people who've, oh, sorry, Nathan.
Just Mary Grace is reminding us to use the Q&A box instead of the chat to submit questions.
Sorry.
And also, you'll find out later towards the end additional ways to get help and resources outside of today's conversation. Sorry, Jen, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks for that correction. But yes, do put questions in the Q&A for us to address at the end. So we've got 8 people who've already completed NDSA levels assessments. That's great. You're ahead of the curve, and you'll find this exercise very, very easy. But perhaps you need to update your assessment, so you can do that now. Okay, so perhaps we'll move on then to the next slide. So we're going to move to the first row of the levels, which is storage, as you saw from the slide Nathan showed you earlier. So hopefully you've already got your own copy of the levels to look at. And what we'd like you to do, and this is where we actually ask you to do some real hard work, so apologies for that, but we'd like you to just have a look at the first row of the levels, which is about storage, and just take a couple of minutes to read across that row and work out where you are currently. I know, there's obviously lots of answers going into Mentimeter straight away, but we will pause a little bit and just give people a chance to read across that row, because there's a bit of brain work that needs to go on here, especially if you're brand new to the levels.
And no one is going to be held to these whatever choices you make today. No one's. This is all anonymous, so don't worry too much about where am I in this. Do what makes sense for you, what you think is where you are in the organization. Yeah,
that's dead right. Remember, you don't need to that you really do need to have fulfilled all the requirements of a level and the previous ones before you can say you meet it. I think that's what Nathan was talking about when he was showing the level slide. That's how it's meant to work. And we totally recognise that some people won't yet be at level 1, which is clear from the results that are coming in already, and that's absolutely fine. There's no shame, as Nathan said, in not yet being at level 1. So everyone's been there at one time or another. So don't worry about that. But I guess one of the nice things about being able to do anonymous benchmarking like this is that you get a sense that you're not alone. You get a sense of, there's other people that are on this journey with you. There's other people that are in a similar position. Perhaps you could buddy up with them and talk about, how you might want to move forward. And I'm also aware you might not actually have all the information at your fingertips right now. So there might be things you need to go away and find out. So perhaps by checking some documentation that you've got internally, or perhaps by asking a colleague or several colleagues. So we do have an I don't know option. So we like to cover every eventuality. obviously, if you're selecting I don't know, it might be you have questions you need to write down and take them away and go and ask people afterwards. And of course, do feel free to ask any questions that occur to you in the Q&A, and we'll have a look at those at the end. Okay, so this is looking good. Got quite a lot of answers in here already. And we've got a real range. So I guess we've got the most people being at level 1, and then a lot of people not being quite yet at level 1, being at level 0, as we sometimes call it. And then a range from decreasing range, I guess, from level 2 to 3 to 4, and a few I don't know. Very small number of people on level 4, which I guess is not that unexpected, because there's quite a lot you need to be doing at level 4.
And those at level 4, although this is anonymous, if they're in your group, right, they're in your networks, they're in your communities. These are additional resources, perhaps, right, that you can discuss, right? As Jen was saying earlier on, it's interesting to know how others are doing this. So there are resources within your own networks in addition to the other places like NDSA.
Absolutely. Okay, so I think that's settled down now. I don't think anyone else is still responding, and I do apologise if I'm rushing you through this and you've not yet had a chance to read through all the rows, but I will move on to the next row of the levels, which is integrity. I'll take us to the next slide. So integrity, yes, do take a look at row 2 and start to think about where you are. That was a quick answer. So this might be a good time to remind you that we also have a set of working definitions that Nathan mentioned. And these working definitions of terms are really useful when you're using the levels grid. You'll be pleased to know there is a definition of integrity information. So it says integrity information is information about digital content that can be used to verify over time that the content is whole and unaltered through loss, tampering, or corruption. At the bit level, this may take the form of checksums. So that's the definition that you get in the accompanying guide. But yeah, the great thing about the levels is it fits on one page, but it's very hard to fit something on one page without having to have documents that sit alongside it and help explain that framework.
I had meant to give a little overview of each of those other functional areas when I had the slide earlier, so it wasn't, if this was brand new to you, it wouldn't be quite so daunting looking at that. So I apologize. But integrity, so Jen's mentioned integrity information, but it's also things like malware checks, making sure you're not bringing in viruses or other types of content that is going to promulgate damage potentially. And also repairing, if you do find issues, trying to take a copy that you have and replace a bad copy with a known good copy. Be very careful about replacing copies, because there's this concept of an independence of copies. And sometimes without realizing it, our copies are all a big chain. And if something happened here, it's going to cascade down. And so sometimes you want to make sure your copies are really more independent and not as integrated. So then you can, if there is a catastrophic damage, it's independent. You can go back to it and you can verify that it is the original content.
Thanks for that, Nathan. It's a good explanation. So we'll wait for a few more answers for this one. Now, this is quite a complicated row of the levels, I think. Again, if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A and we'll look at them later. We'll try and get to them later. There might be, there's certainly some guidance on integrity checking and checksums and things that we could share with you if that was going to be helpful, but we'll leave that to you.
There is no perfect answer for how often to conduct fixity checks. That is something that comes up often, particularly with NDSA or return tos. We've done some work in surveys of practices, but there is no one single best way to go. It's a common question.
Yeah. There's some great work done by the NDSA fixity survey group. they released a survey which really described the state of play for fixity checking, who does it, how often they do it, what tools they use. Really, really useful report that just explains what other people are doing. We can, well, you can Google that. It's a bit hard to provide links, but you can Google for that because it's out there, the NDSA Fixity Survey reports. Really, really useful read.
And fixity is a term that's closely linked with integrity. So, you know, is the file fixed in a certain mode? Let's see.
Yeah. We use some of these terms interchangeably, and perhaps we shouldn't. We should be a little bit clearer. Fixity, integrity, checksums. I will move on to the next slide. But yes, it looks like for this one, more people are at level 0, not yet at level 1. We've got a few, 25% of people at level 1, and then a decreasing range of people going down to level 4. Okay, I'll move us on, and apologies if you've not managed to complete that yet. So row 3 of the levels is control, and this row is all about who can access the content. So we're thinking here about which staff can perform actions on the digital content in the archive. So could someone, for instance, go to your storage location and accidentally delete everything or change everything, or perhaps even not accidentally? So it's important to know who can do what and ensure that access controls are fit for purpose in order to manage any risks. And that's what the increasing requirements in this row are getting at. So firstly, it's sort of understanding who should have access, and then it's documenting and applying those controls. And then it gets more advanced after that. It goes down to audit, I think at level 4, being able to audit and see who's done what to the content.
And it's important to distinguish here, access is internal access, right? It's the access of staff and employees to interact and use that content, or to be able to process it, to be able to do what they need to preserve it. It's not public access. So this is, you know, who has permissions, who has the ability, what are all the ways that you are doing access management, right? Because there are a lot of ways these days with technology. There's a lot of different levels at which you could do that in an infrastructure stack.
Absolutely. There's not quite so much text in this row, so it might take a little bit less time to work out where you are. I can see people are working really quickly on this one.
Maybe, Jen, since we can maybe do some of the answers here that are popping up in the Q&A
right.
while we wait for some people to fill in. So I see there's a question from Paul Clark. For integrity, do you suggest that a full copy rather than incremental be done periodically? Okay, so this to me, this is a backup question, more so than a preservation question. And backup is really about business continuity, disaster recovery, your ability to stand systems back up. Preservation is a little bit of a longer term, a longer game than that. So, you know, being able to restore something immediately isn't as necessarily a priority for preserving content rather than backing up. So typically that sort of incremental and periodic and snapshots, those are backup terms. But if you are those would not be independent copies, but if you are considering a backup copy as a copy there, personally, I would suggest a full copy because the incrementals, you have to use software to recombine things. And so that's an additional complexity or dependency that you're introducing. Any thoughts, Jen?
No, I think you answered that perfectly. Okay. Great, thanks. So for this one, it looks like perhaps people are scoring higher than they were on previous sections, and there's less uncertainty. So maybe just 1% being I don't know. Quite a lot of people on level 1 and level 2 being the highest response here. So that's great. We'll move on to the next slide, I think. So the next row of the levels is all about metadata, everyone's favorite subject. So have a look at that row of the levels and see where you think you are. So I think this one can actually be quite subjective, particularly at level 2, where it talks about there being enough metadata. When is enough metadata? And I guess people might have different understandings of that, different expectations. I point you again to the working definitions of terms. So all the different types of metadata are defined in that working definition of terms document. So the technical, administrative, preservation, all the metadata types that are mentioned in this row. So do take a look at that if you need to, or maybe take a look after this workshop, because I know it's a little bit rushed.
As Jen was mentioning, there are many types of metadata that might be important to capture as part of your preservation plan. But so we tend sometimes to give short shrift to descriptive, because like, oh, that's there, someone else has done that. But it is really important that we capture that because we do need to make sure that not only is the information and objects and content available, but that it's understandable and interpretable by someone in the future. So there's often really important information in metadata, descriptive metadata, right, that conveys a lot about that information. So if we're ignoring descriptive metadata entirely, then we're going to have a bunch of black boxes, right, that someone's going to have to go in and look at every time to figure out what it is.
Really important for discovery and access as well, aren't they? Are there any relevant questions in the chat, Nathan, around metadata? We could take one if there is one.
There's a lot from integrity, it looks like.
Okay, we might need to go back to that later.
Yeah.
Okay. So metadata, it looks like most people are not at level 1 yet. And we've got quite a few at level 1 and then decreasing again. I know we've had some debates in the past about this row of the levels as to whether we've got it the right way round regarding deciding which standards to use. So I think we put that quite late on in the levels. It's been suggested to us that that should come a little bit earlier. But I sometimes think that when you're starting out in digital preservation, you just start gathering metadata, and that's an important step. Is just start bringing it in, thinking about what you need, and thinking about what you need to collect and what's coming with the content. And then later you might need to think a little bit more, sort of strategically about, right, actually we're collecting all this, but we really need to make sure that we're complying with this standard or that standard, and then applying and making that standard work. I should say as well, so the levels underwent a big major review and was released, I think it was 2019, wasn't it? It was a massive undertaking, and we may review it again in the future. We haven't got kind of big plans to jump into that both feet and do a massive review in the next couple of years, but we might. And it does very much depend on community feedback. And if we get a lot of feedback from people saying, the level, you've got it all wrong with the levels, you need to change this and you need to change that, and this doesn't make sense, and this should be added. If we get that kind of feedback, that might trigger us into putting out another version in the future. So, you know, we do take feedback very seriously, and we do look at it and consider it and think about it. So if any of this just doesn't make sense, or if you think we've got it wrong, do tell us. We do like getting feedback. And I'll move on to the next slide on that point, which is the last row of the levels, which is content. So this section, content, is really about understanding the content you're trying to preserve. So including the file formats and all of their dependencies. And also at the more advanced levels, it's about being able to carry out preservation actions on that content when appropriate. So level 4 starts talking about being able to carry out normalizations and migrations and emulation, that kind of thing. But that's not to level 4 that you have to worry about that kind of thing. Initially, it's really just about trying to understand the file formats that you've got. Yeah, so have a look across that row, see where you'd place yourself. Again, pop any questions in the Q&A if you have any.
There's one question in the Q&A here that we can maybe take now. It's maybe adjacent to some of this, but it's any recommended tools for documentation. And that's a big question. That could be a webinar. In fact, I have given a webinar in and of its own on documentation strategies for the Council of State Archivists. So documentation, I think the short answer is do what's going to work for you, you know, and that you're going to keep using. There are a lot of tools. Some of them are more technical than others in how you do documentation. I really like to use actual version control software like Git that was designed for designing software, but it's really great for documentation because you have a complete change history and you can always know who changed when what. But do what you're going to use. I think that's the most important thing about documentation, because if you use a system that no one likes, no one's going to use it. So you need to use a method or a system that people will want to use.
Yeah, actually, funnily enough, at the DPC, we've just kicked off a piece of work this year, which is to try and produce a good practice guide to documentation. So I've just started writing it yesterday, actually, but it's very early stages. But in the next few months, there will be something that's coming out. It might initially be on member preview for DPC members, but after 6 months, it'll be available to everyone. Certainly by September, because I'm hoping to talk about it at IFRS. But yeah, we might not recommend a tool. It might be more, yeah, a template or whatever works for your organization, as Nathan said. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. I'm conscious of time as well. But yes, content again, more people not yet at level 1, and a similar pattern to before. So the next slide. So you've carried out a quick assessment using the NDSA levels. I hope that worked for you, and I hope you were able to engage and that you had enough time, and apologies if you haven't. I'm hoping that it was helpful to you, and I'm hoping that perhaps there might be some follow-on actions that you could take after this workshop. So this was a very quick and dirty way of doing the NDSA levels. There's no doubt ways that you can refine that after this workshop, and hopefully we've given you a taster of how it works and enough information for you to take that away and run with it. But yeah, I just wanted to get a sense of what you thought you might follow up on after this workshop. Are you done with the levels now, or do you think you might carry on working on your assessment or chat to your colleagues about it? Use the levels to say, hey, I need a bit more resource because we need to move up. And perhaps have a plan for how you're going to move up as well, do a bit of forward planning. And as with any maturity model, what we recommend with the NDSA levels is that it's not a one-off activity. It's not something that you only do once, you do it today, that's it, you can put it to one side, never think about it again. We want it to be something that you can use frequently, or maybe annually, or every two or 3 years, just to check in, see where you are. Are we still there? Have we moved on? What do we need to do to move forward? So this is a sliding scale question. I just wanted to give you the chance to work out whether you agree with these statements or not. But this is looking really encouraging so far. It's good to see, I guess the statement you're most strongly agreeing with is just that you're going to go away and carry on working on this. And so I'm glad that we've got you started, and glad that we've got you thinking about this. And that you feel like it's a tool that you could use going forward. It's really good stuff. And actually starting a conversation with colleagues, that's the next highest at the moment. That's a really good thing to do as well. It's great to have, I used to take this to colleagues in IT who didn't understand digital preservation, but I could take this grid to them and say, look, this is what I'm trying to do. These are all technical elements of digital preservation. And they could try and help me out and try and work through some of the problems with me. I'll move this on now. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to encourage us to move on. That's all.
Yeah. So comments and feedback. I'm not going to leave this up here, but if you have comments and feedback about the levels and you want to share that with us, do type that in now, and we'll go back and look at that later. As I say, that's all really very much appreciated. But we'll just go back to our slideshow. I'll stop sharing this now. And we've just got a few slides to finish up with.
Just get to the right screen. Okay, so some other relevant resources, some of them are actually connected to the levels. So we did a very quick and dirty assessment, as Jen mentioned here, to try to get you to be thinking about this and think about where your organization lies. But there actually is an assessment tools for the levels of digital preservation that walks you through. It's like a big Excel spreadsheet. You start to assess where you are. You see this heat map of colors as to what you're at capacity for or what you're under capacity. One thing that's really important if you're looking at this tool is like, well, what are you assessing? Right, because not everything needs to necessarily be preserved at the same level. So I recommend using this to just assess your baseline capacity. Not to say that you're going to preserve everything at level 4, but if you had to, do you have the capability to do that? And if you don't, this will help you identify what you need to do to get to level 4. Next here, this is the DPM or Digital Preservation Management Organization Maturity Model. Some of you may have seen this before. There's sort of big two things that come out of this work. One is this three-legged stool. So the levels are technology focused, but it's important to remember that organization and resources are just as important to technology. And actually some might say more so because you need it in order to do the technology. The next here is these 5 stages of digital preservation program development. And these are really thinking about your organization as a whole. So, acknowledge, yes, digital preservation is a thing. We should be doing that, right? Act, okay, I'm going to start some projects. I'm going to do some fixity verification over here and see what this is like. Suddenly you're building into projects or building into programs and you're consolidating and you're starting to actually maybe have some program management at your institution. Level 4 is institutionalizing. So that's like building it into the fabric and the mission of your organization so that no one could ever imagine us not doing digital preservation. This is everyone has drunk the Kool-Aid. And then externalize is when you're working with other organizations. You might be part of a distributed digital preservation network. You might be a member of the NDSA or the DPC, but you're taking it and you're talking this work and you're part of that larger community because we all have to face these problems and solve them, and we can't all do it on our own. And Jen's going to come in here.
Okay, yeah, so another maturity model I mentioned at the start was the DPC's rapid assessment model. So if you enjoyed using the NDSA levels today and wanted to try another similar tool, DPC RAM might be the one to look at. So it's got rapid in the name because it is, like the levels, designed to be fairly quick and easy to use. It's not as quick as the levels, I would say. So the levels has 5 sections, whereas RAM has 11. So it will take at least double the time. But it does look more holistically at digital preservation. It doesn't just focus on the technology. We think about access as well, and organizational things like staffing and resourcing policies. So do take a look at that. It's freely available to you. Next slide, please. And another framework you might be interested in is the Levels of Born Digital Access, which was created by the DLF Born Digital Archives Working Group. And this model is heavily inspired by the NDSA levels, but intended to address that gap that the levels left around facilitating access to digital content, and specifically born digital content. Next slide, please.
So an important part here about all this work is if you decide to take something in, you should have the organizational capacity to properly steward that material. But sometimes there can be a disconnect between our curators who are acquiring new materials and what is actually possible within the organization. And so this is a supplement to the levels. It's a curatorial decision tree and visual guide that is meant to be used during that acquisitions process to ensure that you are the most appropriate place. And this is more technical than anything else, but that you have the capacity to preserve that material. And you can see there's sort of 4 quadrants here. Collection development is certainly part of it, but then we have security, intellectual access, or technical access. And each of those quadrants or areas has a flow chart. And there's a guide that walks through each of these areas on this flow chart. So, am I even able to preserve this? No. Okay, well, what is it I need to do? Do I have the workflows? No. Okay, I need to revisit. So revisit might be talking to your IT to change that gap. It might be, I'm sorry, but we're not the most appropriate collecting institution to hold these materials.
And just to finish up, there are just a few other things we wanted to mention to you in case you want to continue this conversation with us about the levels. So firstly, we've got a regular levels office hour. We hold that every couple of months. You've actually just missed one because it clashed with this meeting, but we anticipate the next one will probably be in June. So anyone's welcome to come along and share your thoughts. And we're also trying to find out a bit about how people are using the NDSA levels. So we're looking at a number of specific scenarios, and we've got a Google form open at the moment that's collecting answers to a number of questions. So perhaps if you're more experienced at using the levels, you might want to dive in and have a look at that. And then finally, we've got an ongoing levels feedback form, which is open all the time. And as I said, we're happy to take feedback about the levels or any of our outputs at any point. And we do discuss them in our steering group meetings. So do comment on that if you want to. And the last slide. Yes, so that's just about everything. A big thank you to you for engaging in the workshop element of this session and for listening to us. And thanks to all of those who've contributed to these slides. Our contact details are there if you need to contact us after this event. But we're happy to open the floor to any questions. I see there are some questions building up in the Q&A.
Yes, there are actually. So we've only got about 9 minutes left, so we'll see what we can get through. First question real quick, who can join NDSA?
Anyone. It is meant more for organizations than individuals. There's kind of a little exception process there, but it's really intended to be a coalition or a consortium of organizations, an alliance, as the title says. So anyone is able to sign up. All you have to do is fill out a form. There is no membership fee. You attest that you will commit to the values, but also that there will be people from your organization who can participate in NDSA activities, like our interest groups or different working groups.
So there was the really long question at the very beginning. What suggestions would you have for those who have the capability to fulfill a requirement at a higher level than what their digital preservation program fully meets for that given functional area, i.e. having part level 3, but being overall to level 2? In other words, is it possible to use this assessment tool in a more iterative way rather than building in a linear fashion through each successive level?
Absolutely. You might have a collection that needs storage level 4, metadata level 2. So that is possible. So if you need to build up your program, then you can use these as a way to sort of figure it out. And if you need to, I need to do that first, that's okay. Like they are successive. So if you're doing level 4, you should be doing level 3, but you can still develop the capacity to do level 4 while you're doing that. Anything else, Jen? Okay.
Is it weird to be at a different levels depending on category?
No.
By category, do you mean functional, like the functional area, so control or storage or whatever? I think that's what they mean. And no, that's not weird at all. That's quite normal. So some people, like we saw with the results in the Mentimeter, that one section, I think it was control, people were generally more advanced in that section than they were in the others, just as a kind of an average. So that was an interesting observation. I need to go back and look at the statistics now, but no, it's not weird. You're definitely not weird.
What tools do you recommend for checking integrity?
Well, there's lots of them. Actually, the fixity survey report from the NDSA is quite good because you can see what tools other people are using, and that's often the best thing to do, isn't it? To say, right, what are they doing? I'm going to see if that's popular. I'll have a look at that. So there's a tool I used to use called Checksum by Cause. It's not a very exciting name, but it does what it says on the tin. But it depends, because quite a lot of people have these tools built into their digital preservation systems. So they'll kind of be using what their system uses, or their storage system even. I don't know, Nathan, you'll probably have more to say on that.
I'd probably just check that fixity report and see what tools are mentioned there, because there are a lot of tools, and there are some older ones and newer ones, and it doesn't necessarily matter a whole lot. It's sort of what tool works best in your situation. So I'd encourage folks to take a look at that report.
Yeah, and thanks for putting that in the chat as well. That link's gone in the chat. So that's great.
can either of you describe what an inventory of digital files looks like?
An inventory of digital files. So it's like a digital asset register, I think, isn't it? I'm just wondering if the working definition of terms tells us more specifically. But it's a list. It'll be a spreadsheet, I would think, and it would say what files you've got, what location they're at, maybe a bit of a description, so that you've got a sense of what you've got where at a high level.
And it might not be at a file level, right? You might sort of do it by collection or category of content. I'm sorry, Jen, for overstepping there.
No, go for it.
I was just, yeah, I think I'm done.
Is it recommended to delete the source copy of a digital record once it has been archived and preserved?
I think depends on what you mean by source copy.
Maybe the copy outside the archive. So is it more, you've got a copy elsewhere. Once it's in the archive, you might want to delete that and use the version in the archive instead. Yeah, perhaps. But I'd say always keep the original copy within the archive. Though, I mean, don't overwrite or delete that. So if you then migrated that into something else, don't delete the original, keep it as was, and make sure you've got that checksum, that fixity information, so you can kind of verify that you've still got the authentic copy that you originally received.
Can the cloud be considered stable storage and count as one or more of your geographic locations if you research where the data center is actually located? And are some cloud storage options considered more stable than others?
There's a lot there. I'm trying to track down a link right now. Here we go. If Mary Grace can share this in. This is a link to the 2019 Storage Infrastructure Survey, which talks a little bit about this, but the cloud can certainly be a viable copy for your materials, but it really, it all depends on how you do it and how that is enabled. And I would distinguish, but with cloud being places with object storage, so Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Backblaze, Bleed2, Wasabi. I would distinguish those from things like Google Drive, Microsoft SharePoint, or OneDrive. Either could be used, but how you use it might be a little bit different. And you do need to pay attention to where the data center, the availability zone or region that storage is configured in. It's not always easy or possible to even tell that for things like Google Drive or SharePoint, but that is a configuration option for the object storage, Azure and AWS I referred to. Jen, anything else?
Yeah, I think it's just about not having all your eggs in one basket, perhaps. The same with any sort of storage. You don't want to put it all in one place and nowhere else at all, because then you're completely reliant on one service provider. That's always the worry. So it's like you might have one copy in the cloud and have one copy more locally, perhaps, would be a more suitable solution. And it's about also different clouds. And it's about being able to ask the right questions of the cloud providers as well, and really unpick what they're doing with it and where it is.
Well, thank you, Jenny and Nathan, for all of your time and answering all of the questions. For everyone else, the next Lunch and Learn session is on Old Germanic script, and it'll be held Thursday, May 4th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you all have a pleasant afternoon.
Thank you, Vincent and Mary Grace. Bye, everyone.
Bye all. Thank you.